Hello, welcome everybody to this IQS online discussion event. My name is Matt Leafer. I'm the co-director of the Institute for Quantum Studies here at Chapman University. We've had a couple of these talks about quantum mechanics before. Today is going to be something a bit different about space. So our guest today is Kate Greene, who is a writer and a poet, and she was a participant in the High Seas mission, which simulated a Martian environment on Earth. She's the author of the book, Once Upon a Time I Lived on Mars, which we'll be doing a book giveaway towards the end of this event. So would you like to say hi, Kate?
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And we have two guest moderators today who are also very interested in space science. So our two local moderators are Anna Leahy, who is the director of the MFA in Creative Writing here at Chapman University. She's also a published writer and poet. And we also have Douglas Dechow, who is the Digital Humanities Science and Engineering Librarian here at Chapman. And they are authors also of a book about space called Generation Space. So I'm going to hand it over to Anna and Doug to talk to Kate, and then I'll be back for the Q&A at the end.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you. We are thrilled to be here. I thought we could start with the context in which we're all living right now. So I was reading this book over the last few weeks, and it struck me that this is the perfect book for pandemic times because we're all sort of separated from each other. We're isolated to one extent or another, not to the extent that you were for 4 months, but this has been going on for 8 months now. And I want to read one quote from the book, and then maybe you can sort of respond to this idea that this is pandemic reading. Let's see, this is on page 105 for anyone who has the book handy. It's true that environments that are too predictable feel sterile and can lead to boredom and lethargy. And an easy way to feel young is to experience something new, to travel, to see things with fresh eyes. But I wonder, isn't it true that most of us can habituate to anything? Isn't it our nature to minimize effort and discomfort? And that has me thinking about how I have not and have habituated to the pandemic. So you want to comment on that and this relationship of your experience to what we're experiencing now?
Oh yeah, that's such an interesting excerpt to read. Well, I mean, just to kind of set the scene with what was going on for High Seas, it was a 4-month simulated Mars mission that took place inside a dome, like a 2-story dome, about the size, square footage of a 2-bedroom apartment. Essentially, there were 6 of us in there together, and we acted as though we were astronauts on a surface Mars mission for 4 months. And that meant that we couldn't go outside unless we were wearing spacesuits. So this protective gear, this getup that we had to get into, and it took a couple of people to help, get everyone together. So it was like really a production to go outside and then to come back inside. And, it just, we were really cut off from the outside world, in particular too, because our communications were delayed. As if you were on Mars, you couldn't speak in real time with anyone. So that did a number on the psychology of really not being on Earth, actually.
And that's very different than the pandemic because I'm on my phone all the time.
Exactly, I know. Zoom is the thing, and everyone is talking in real time using FaceTime, video calls, what have you. So yeah, it is different, but there really is something to the sameness. And inside that dome on the High Seas mission, Kim Binstead, who started the whole project, a professor at the University of Hawaii, I remember her saying it was important that we have inflatable furniture, because she said, I want you to be able to move and change your environment. And that was a fantastic idea. I have to say, I don't think we took advantage of that as much as we could have. We had movie nights on Wednesdays and Saturdays. We moved the couches around. It felt special. It felt different. But really, day in and day out, the sameness of those white walls, curved walls around us, and our schedule. We ate every meal together. You know, the number of outfits I had didn't really change that much. The number of outfits I saw my crewmates wear did not change that much. Everyone had their own habits, and they started to really become apparent over time. And so that's the sort of thing that I think has happened to a lot of people during this pandemic, just from conversations I've had, that you know, there is a sameness that that kind of creeps into your day-to-day, and time gets really funny in those situations. I mean, it just sort of smears out and compresses, and it behaves unlike normal times. So I don't know if that really addresses that that passage in particular, but you know, related to that passage, I could talk a little bit more about, like, I think a little bit after that, I talk about the artists and architects, Arakawa and Madeline Gins. And I was just sort of revisiting their work, because they have this project, they have these structures built in Japan, and then there's one here in New York, that East Hampton, that it's Life Extending Villa is what it's called. And these structures are so strange. The floors are slanted and bumpy, and there are poles just installed so that you can grab a hold of it, so that you don't fall down, so that you can make your way around a corner. It's really an uncomfortable environment, and it was designed that way so that you're always sort of adjusting and being aware of your body in space. And I think that during this pandemic, that's something that a lot of people, like, our worlds have just shrunk to the size of our habitats, basically, for the most part. I mean, there are some excursions out to grocery stores, what have you, and depending on where you are in the country, of course, it's very different. But by and large, the sense of our bodies in space has changed collectively. And I do wonder what the collective effect of that actually is and will be going forward.
Yeah, I'm totally curious of that. And I think Doug and I can both attest to, we put on outfits today that we haven't worn for 8 months. So we use this to mix up our life.
Yeah. I mean, that was the thing. You had to really find ways to change your environment. So our chief scientist, Shahida Sierra Sastras, she brought in new science experiments. Like, she knew that every 2 weeks she wanted to be doing a new experiment. She didn't want to have a single experiment that stretched the entire duration of the mission. She knew she would be bored. Another crew member, Cyan Proctor, brought in art projects. And so she was always doing something new and different. You know, I just really respected their approach to, like, staying active and staying mentally engaged and changing their environment and what they were doing. So those are little things like that are really important, I think.
That particular passage in the book, I was very curious about the notion of mixing up the environment or making small tweaks to the environment in a architectural setting, because that fixes that change and gives us as humans a chance to then become habituated to that site. So I'm you know, I haven't had a chance to look into it deeper, but I was very curious as to what their real underpinnings of their theory is, that you have to continually juxtapose your physicality between the outside world, which is, you know, normatized in some fashion, and then re-enter their space that's slightly off kilter to get the benefit that they're after. I found it a very curious proposition to begin with.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think there's a park that they designed where you really are almost always falling, so you have to often use your hands, and so there's some sense of you know, using your whole body for mobility, and like maybe a more childlike engagement with the environment. And that can kind of spur maybe the sort of latent creativity, something that's been lost when you do habituate to the environment. So that unsteadiness and just having to use like more of your body, certainly you could get used to it, but I agree. I wonder exactly that question, like what is it to habituate to anything, and how do you keep it fresh? I mean, when your world shrinks like it has during this pandemic, it is a real challenge.
Well, go ahead.
Your comments also remind me of the section where you're talking about how maybe someone who uses prosthetic limbs, prosthetic legs, would be ideally suited to be an astronaut, because in low gravity, no gravity, you don't need your legs and they actually get in the way. So I think this whole idea of the physical surroundings that we take for granted, how are we aware of them? How are we not aware of them? When they change, what do we become aware of, not just in the surroundings, but our bodies?
Absolutely. And it's just like, you know, it takes something kind of drastic to sometimes make you aware of your environment, your actual environment. So in effect, the pandemic has made us all disabled in some way. And you wrote that wonderful essay for Aeon on accessibility and design. And when I saw that you had written that, I was so pleased that we would be talking, just because I knew that we had that in common. That passage in the book came from the fact that my brother was born with spina bifida, and so he used a wheelchair for most of his life. And I just saw how difficult it is for a person in a wheelchair to engage with the environment. I mean, just the stuff that an able-bodied person takes for granted is really, I mean, it's just really, it's everything, you know, and the fact of curb cuts didn't always exist, and yet how useful they are for all of us, you know? So yeah, my brother asked me if I thought that like someone who didn't have the use of their legs would be a good astronaut. And I mean, it really did get me thinking. Of course, in gravity, in low gravity, you don't need your legs at all. They bump around, and they're actually your largest muscles. And so if you need to exercise them so that you don't lose muscle mass and bone density. And so they're actually a liability. And if you're a designer and you're thinking about sending people to Mars, you're thinking about that like 8-month trip to Mars and what the bodies actually need in that scenario. And I mean, if you're sending like amputees, then that might make a lot of sense. As soon as they get back to gravity, they can actually just put on their legs, you know? And then that's just another design consideration. But it's something that isn't really considered by designers at NASA or, you know, in the astronaut selection. I think that astronauts are generally selected for, you know, physically normative bodies.
Which is amazing, because in a way, NASA actually acknowledges the answer to the question, but doesn't do anything about it. One of their own experiments that's writing on ISS right now is Robonaut, which originally was an anthropomorphic form, human form, without legs, and, you know, did work and experiments on the ISS, and continues to do so, I believe so. I haven't looked into it in a while. So, you know, they actually understood enough of that question to go ahead and design an experiment that would take advantage of it, but it still remains factored into.
Yeah. I mean, that robot, it's easy when you're just designing a robot, when you're designing some sort of object, but when you're selecting human beings to go to space, it's like the engineering gets really kind of complicated, and you start to think politically, even if you don't realize you're thinking politically. So the astronaut body has always been highly politicized, and the robots that you sent to space there's a lot more freedom to design a sort of like differently bodied robot, I'd say.
And you make a good case for an all-woman crew to go to Mars. You want to talk a little bit about that? Because
Sure.
I'd volunteer.
Yeah. a good case. Thank you for saying that. You know, when I originally proposed it in a Slate article, I think 2014 or 2015, the mission was in 2013. And it was a little tongue in cheek, you know. I like a purely economic argument for something that might seem a little socially kind of like unusual. And in this case, I was, during the high seas mission, I noticed that the guys on the crew tended to eat more. They would go back for seconds, and like generally twice as much as the women on the crew. We were composed of 3 men and 3 women. And I was also collecting sensor data on everyone because I was doing a sleep study. And even though I didn't know whose numbers belonged to who, I was able to see that like the guys were on average like using 3,000 plus calories a day, whereas the 3 of us women on the crew were using less than 1,800. So like that's, I mean, if you think about the payload of a mission, that's actually a pretty huge cost, because the heavier a mission, the more rocket fuel you need, the more rocket fuel you need, the heavier the actual ship is getting into space. And so if you can do anything to reduce weight, I thought on a like 2.5-year mission to Mars, if you could cut in half the weight of the food, which is, that's not going to be a trivial amount of weight, that's actually significant weight savings, then you could probably, you could use that, you know, it's an engineering problem. You could use that to do other things, send more experiments, or just have a cheaper mission to Mars if you had a crew of all women. So, you know, it just occurred to me, I looked into it, turns out there have been engineers at NASA who have also proposed this. This isn't a new idea. It's been around for a while. And so, yeah, I wrote that piece for Slate, and it was fun to see the reactions. And then I brought it up again in the book, just because it really gets to the point of astronaut selection and who gets to go into space, and how it isn't a pure engineering problem as much as people want to believe it is. You know, it's actually quite political.
Yeah, and that actually, for our own story, brings up a lovely anecdote. It's a perfect moment. We had an opportunity 10 years ago, at least, maybe a little bit less than that, 8 years ago, interview astronaut Mary Cleave, who's an environmental scientist by training. And, you know, she told the astronaut, John Young himself, during an interview, why she should be selected to be an astronaut. And her answer was, I'll give you an almost full-size brain for half the payload price. Mary's a diminutive woman, and, you know, it just fits perfectly with that notion. The issues that NASA has had in the selection process with women, though, go all the way back to, you know, the beginning of NASA. There was a very, very well thought out effort put together by Jacqueline Cochran, who ran the WASP program for the United States during World War II, and she gathered together a number of female astronauts, wannabes, and, you know, argued to NASA that they should be put through the same set of tests. And
yeah,
you know, to no good end.
Exactly. I mean, it just goes to show like the decision making isn't necessarily super rational. It's often about optics. It's often about you know, personalities. It's just like anything else, to be honest. But it's often billed as something that is, you know, these are the best of the best. Well, yes, they are very good in a way, but there are other bests out there too. So
Right.
yeah.
And your point about, actually, this all leads into another very nice opportunity for discussion. If you don't mind, I'm going to do a very quick screen share. And if you could, when I do, I think you've seen the photograph before. It's of you at high seas. For the audience who's watching, high seas stands for Hawaii Space Exploration, Analog, and Simulation. Those of us who are NASA fans know that they love their acronyms. Let me go ahead and show that picture very briefly. And if you could tell us what we're seeing there.
Yes. So this is a This is a picture of the dome that we lived in. This is on the volcano Mauna Loa. In the background is Mauna Kea, and that is the dormant volcano that has telescopes on it. So making a lot of astronomical discoveries over there. In the foreground is me in a spacesuit simulator. That's not a real spacesuit. It's one that we tested out from the University of Maryland just to tell them how it fit, how it worked, but it was cumbersome like a real spacesuit. And that's kind of the goal of spacesuit simulators, is to make you uncomfortable because that's the real deal. And you see some solar panels, you see a generator, you see a structure that's to the right of the dome, and that's the CCAN where we had like a workshop. You have gray water, black water tanks, and you see some clouds and a blue sky, which wouldn't be the case on Mars, but those red rocks were quite enough to give us the sense that we were not really spending our time on Earth.
Thanks for that description. So related to that, and some of the other points that we were making, we were just talking about food. High seas as an experiment is kind of has a fascinating origin story of itself. The researcher that you mentioned earlier, Dr. Kim Binstead, conceived of high seas from an assumption about food and food preparation. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Just to give a little bit more background, High Seas is a project that ran for 5 years, NASA funded, and the overarching goal was to understand crew dynamics in an isolated environment, similar to what would be experienced on a Mars mission. Now, the very first mission, which was the mission that I was a part of, got kicked off to study specifically food systems. Now, Kim Binstead participated in her own 4-month simulated Mars mission on Devon Island in Canada. And during this mission, she recognized that food played kind of an outsized role in crew cohesion, in making people, she had a homesick crewmate and who is also Canadian. And so they made poutine, even though the ingredients for poutine weren't quite restaurant quality. The effort was really appreciated and did a great job of cheering him up. And then they recognized if they could just make fun meals to celebrate even minor milestones, that their mood was so improved. And I actually want to say that that's something that during this pandemic I've recognized as well. Trying out new recipes. I know so many people have too, but trying out new recipes and actually celebrating meals and recognizing how special a meal is that you're potentially sharing with someone, if you can do that, or getting together over Zoom or something like that. That's just, it's been so important during this time of isolation, and she recognized it then. And so the initial proposal was to see if when you land on Mars, you have gravity again. And so you don't have to just eat the food out of the silver pouches like they do on the space station. So she thought, well, what would it be like if you just sent shelf-stable ingredients on a mission to Mars, so that when the astronauts landed, they could cook up their own meals. So they could make a novel stir fry or bake a cake or just do something, pizza from scratch, just something that they've been craving the whole time that they hadn't had a chance to eat. And might it be good to just mix it up? Plus, there's some advantages to shelf-stable foods, less packaging, and there's no water in them, so extremely light. They're dehydrated, like dehydrated cheeses and butter powder and all this stuff. So our mission looked at these two food systems, a food system that was essentially just add water and heat. We used backpacking food to simulate that because there just isn't enough actual astronaut food to go around, so it wouldn't have made sense to use that. So that was the one system, and then the other system was the cooking. We had cooking days where we could use dehydrated chicken and any spices you needed and oils and what have you, but it was all just you put it together yourself. So we made sushi, surprisingly. That was pretty great. Spam musubi, a beef tagine. We had a lot of eggs and omelets and really great breakfast foods. So yeah, it was, I mean, I think that it's kind of radical to think about space exploration as a truly human endeavor. It's so often looked at as an engineering problem to solve. But when you can understand that the human part of that system has particular requirements, and if you can actually optimize those in a creative way, then I think that the chances of a mission being successful are that much greater. I mean, Kim Binstead has said that if the human component of a space mission fails, it can be just as disastrous as if a rocket explodes. So, I mean, that's absolutely true on a 2.5-year mission to Mars or any long duration space exploration where you're so far away from home, so isolated. The psychological, sociological impact of that journey is just, I mean, it's kind of an unknown. So if you can really dial into what it is that make teams of people work well together and what makes people in those situations function better, then I think that that's going to be critical to having a successful mission to Mars.
And how much control over the scheduling of things then did you have? I mean, did you get to choose which days you got the sushi? Or
yeah, we absolutely did. And that's another way that a Mars mission is going to be so different from any space missions that are happening now, because, you know, there's instantaneous communication between mission control and the ISS, and it's mission control. You know, they are truly dictating the schedule. And on a mission to Mars, you're not going to have a mission control, you're going to have a mission support, and there's going to be so much more crew autonomy. And so because of that, we were also allowed to create our own schedules and decide our menus and how we wanted to do it. You know, other crews that came in after us didn't eat all 3 meals together. You know, there were other ways to do it that you know, we didn't do. Others didn't have as strict a schedule as we did. We actually had a very strict schedule for the 4 months. That was an interesting experiment in and of itself. It wasn't actually part of the experiment, but to see the way that that schedule, the strictures of that kind of wore on people was very interesting. We had to, in the last month or so, adjust that kind of significantly because people were just worn down by it.
That's fascinating. And that gets me thinking back to the routines of the pandemic and how small things have become in terms of my schedule. I'm also then curious about what you were allowed to bring with you and sort of who decided to bring what.
Yeah. Let's see, what were we allowed to bring with us? I mean, it was pretty open. We didn't have the restrictions of the weight restrictions, like if you were actually traveling on a rocket. So I brought a box of books, which would not have flown on an actual flight.
Can you talk a little bit about which books? Because you mentioned Bachelard's The Poetics of Space in the book, and you mentioned one of our favorite books of all time, Michael Collins's Carrying the Fire. I think that's an amazing piece of writing. Definitely he's the best astronaut writer. Were those books that you mentioned in your book part of the mission, or were there other books you brought? And how big was the box?
The box was like, I don't know, bread box, maybe a little bit bigger than a bread box. And I brought Colin's book because it was truly an inspiration. It kind of, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut, and then I strayed a bit from that through high school and a little bit into college. But then I came across his book in a used bookstore, not knowing anything about it, and just kind of assuming that it was going to be the tale of how Apollo came to be. You know, he was a command module pilot, right? That was his official title on Apollo 11. So he dropped off Aldrin and Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong and then circled the moon and then picked them back up. That was his position. And he's an excellent writer. He's so sensitive to so many things that, I've read some astronaut books, and most astronaut books just can't even come close to his sensitivity and his noticing of things. One thing that really struck me about, I know you asked about the books, but I just love carrying the fire.
Yeah, you can keep talking about Michael Collins all night.
Yeah, he talked about how he noticed that when they were doing like public affairs training, that everyone, the astronauts had to, when they had their hands on their hips, they were told to put their thumbs back, because to hold your thumbs forward on your hips was considered too feminine. And so they were really needing to project a sort of like all-American male image. And, as a queer person reading that, I was just so satisfied by the fact that he recognized that, like, how much gender presentation just in this small way mattered to the space program, and that was fascinating to me. So those sorts of things are really special. He had a really interesting view. I would almost say he had the poet's view of the Apollo 11 mission, because he was in it, but then he in some ways was outside the main action and could always just be like a poet, sort of observing and singing the song of what actually happened. So he's a very special astronaut. That's a very special book. I did bring that one, and then a few other random books. I didn't bring the Bachelard. I brought Are You My Mother by Alison Bechdel, and I was grateful that I brought some graphic novels, because for the first month I was there, I just couldn't focus. It was such a strange new environment. I couldn't read anything. I was really frustrated, actually, because my job was to be a crew writer, and I was second in command as well, and conducting a sleep experiment, but I really wanted to get some reading done. I really wanted to do some writing, but I couldn't until I started. I just read the graphic novels that I brought, and that I think that mode of reading was really interesting and good for my brain. I needed something different, and I found that to be the case too earlier this year, when we all sort of hunkered down. I live in New York, and things got pretty serious here around mid-March, and I couldn't focus on anything. But then I started reading graphic novels again. I actually picked up the March series about Congressman John Lewis, and I'd had that with me, and so I was able to reread that, and that was really great.
So that's, I mean, you mentioned Lewis. That's obviously, for those of you who haven't read the book, but will soon be, to further entice you to pick up a copy and read this fantastic book. There is a passage in there that takes place in the last months of your brother's life, and it's the simple act of working together to craft a letter for him to send to John Lewis. And so can you tell us a little bit about Mark's political activism, and actually what it was like? There's an odd tension, and I don't know if you can pull it apart, but you're very honest in discussing the fact that your brother is dying and he knows that he's dying, but you're engaging in a creative act. You're producing something that will live past him, and I found that fascinating, that act.
Yeah, so Mark was extremely political. He was on a number of local committees in Johnson County, Kansas. This is where we grew up. And, he had run for office numerous times, and he was just like highly involved with the Kansas Democrats. And he also he went to Topeka a lot, and he would hang out and make sure that the people who were signing bills into law knew actually what they were signing. He found out that more often than not, most of them didn't know a lot of the details of what they were signing. And he actually stopped legislation from happening because people weren't aware that they would be signing things that were against what they nominally stood for, what their constituents wanted. He was active in that way. He was kind of like a gadfly, I would have to say, in Topeka. But he was also, in the last years of his life, he was on dialysis for almost 15 years. And, just recognizing the difficulty of the kidney transplant system and in particular living donors and the lack of protections that living donors actually have, and how there are the incentives aren't necessarily there to make it the easiest process. So he had gotten support from a local congressman for a bill that was going through the House. And so that was a huge victory for him. He did that while he was in a hospital bed. He kept calling this congressman's office. And finally, after a few weeks of doing that, they said, yes, okay, Kevin Yoder will support this bill. And so that's what happened. And then he said, okay, so my sights are set on Congressman Lewis, who he had met because he was what's it called when he was a delegate to one of the Democratic conventions. And that's when he got to meet his hero, John Lewis, who is he's such an inspiration to so many people in terms of activism and, kind of fighting for justice. And so he wanted to write this letter to John Lewis, but he couldn't do it because, the state of his health was so poor, but he had written it in his head. And so he dictated it to me and I was able to write it out. And then, he never felt like it was quite exactly what he wanted. And we kept tweaking it over phone calls. I was able to be with him. I was living in San Francisco at the time. I was able to be with him for some of it, but we would have these phone calls and he would tell me more and I'd go back and change it. And then just the night before he died, I asked him if it was where he wanted it to be, and he said no. And so we looked over it again, and it was this it was kind of a difficult process because he wasn't able to speak very well, and we were just kind of trying to figure it out, and it was it was a really important moment to share with him, to have that time with him in person, and then to share it over his activism and for doing something good politically. That was a really special thing.
Yeah, and it brings together current zeitgeist with Congressman Lewis's passing. You actually indicate in the book, again, to further encourage folks to pick this up because it's just such a lovely memoir series of essays. I don't know, maybe at some point you can discuss more about the writing and how you feel it is. But one of the things, of course, that appeals to me so much is that the author of it, as Anna pointed out, mentioned some of my favorite literary touchstones, including the poetics of space and a handful of other things, are things that clearly resonated with you and wind up in the book. But your background is that you're a scientist. You went to graduate school, studied solid state physics, played with lasers, as anybody knows you normally do with lasers. And so you blend literature and lasers. What's it feel like to do that?
Oh, that's great. No one has ever said blending literature and lasers, but I really like that. I just, I've mostly just followed my interests and kind of not denied the things that I want to know about and learn. And so when I was younger, I was very invested in understanding the invisible realm of, atoms and electrons, neutrons and protons and photons. And I just wanted to know, I wanted to be in that world. I wanted to understand it. This is the stuff that makes up all of us. And so I went there, but I think it's actually, I kind of just like the invisible in general. I think that maybe that's the connector, because as I went from working with lasers directly into science journalism, which was great. That was almost like eating candy, because you didn't have to do the science. You didn't have to slog through the science. No offense to anyone who is, I mean, if you're slugging through the science, you know what I'm talking about. But you got to learn about all the science, like such a wide array of science, and you got to write about it. And so that's how I kind of grew up as a writer, as a science journalist specifically. And yeah, but over time I realized that I needed to kind of move a little bit, move my, like, kind of move my soul a little bit toward more toward the ineffable, maybe. And the exposition of science writing had its place, but it wasn't as satisfying as it had been. And so I think when I started to just kind of assume more of a poet's role in the world, you know, part of it is I met some poets, and I had never really hung out with poets before, and I thought,
And of course you changed your mind and wanted to be a poet.
I mean, the conversations that poets have are unlike anything I had ever experienced. I mean, I like conversations with physicists, don't get me wrong. I was a conversation with physicists for a long time, but like poets, that's something special. So I think that I just sort of, moved myself more professionally toward that. Although, can you say professional for a poet? I don't think that that's quite right. So
No, but that moving your soul, that works really well.
yeah, that's
poetry. Doug brought this up already though, and this is sort of backing up the bus from poetry, which I'm happy to come back to. But this idea that this isn't a typical memoir. It's not typical science writing. It's not linear. It's done in essays. How did you make those decisions? I can read into it based on my movement from poetry to nonfiction, but you're coming at it from the other direction, and I'm curious about the decisions you made on what to include and how to tell stories and how to break these up into essays instead of having some kind of narrative arc. You know, here's day one of our Mars experiment and end with the end of the experiment.
Yeah. Well, you know, I actually started writing this book in earnest in 2018. So that's 5 years after the mission. I had a lot of notes. I had my journal. I had other things that I'd written during the mission. But I got to tell you, like 5 years out, I couldn't think that there was an arc to the actual mission itself that lent itself to a good narrative to hang anything on, you know. And in fact, I think a narrative arc requires a certain kind of drama that I didn't want to like. I felt like at that point I would be fabricating it. There were dramatic moments for sure on the mission. Don't get me wrong. 6 people figuring it out for 4 months, you know, in this isolated situation. There was some drama, but like also that didn't feel like the right thing to talk about, because that's not what I got out of the mission at all. I was thinking about things. So the essays are split up into topics around like big ideas like isolation or correspondence or deep time, deep space. And that came from the fact that I just kept returning again and again to certain ideas in conversation with people afterwards. So, you know, just basically to stop talking about those things, I had to write them down. And then the way that the essays themselves are constructed, you know, I've been told it's a pretty smooth read. They're pretty easy to read. And I think that's because of my journalistic background and my tendency to explain things clearly. So you get a lot of that, but I've also been told that it has a movement to it. It jumps around. There aren't a ton of transitions, but in that I kind of attribute to a more poetic type of thinking. So when I wrote many of these essays, I wrote by, like, I had collected a lot of information around it around the topic, and I would read it and think about it and think about it and think about it. And then I would just sit down and kind of like shoot from the hip, and wherever I wanted to go, I just went. I trusted the instinct there, which is kind of how poems happen for me. I just like, I'm curious to see what will follow. And so in that way, the structure of the essays themselves have like more of a leap quality to them, and honor the consciousness that's producing them, I guess.
Can you talk a little bit more then about the move to poetry? And to go back to the book, you actually sort of ended up with a poetry reading project for the 4 months with the 120 poems for a poem a day, basically, which if you go to poets.org, anybody can sign up for a poem a day, but you had a sort of a reading project of a poem a day for the
experiment. Well, I mean, my it's interesting when you start to sort of like orient your life more toward poetry. Like you start to see connections everywhere, and like things just kind of start to happen. And I think maybe around 2010 is when I started to do that. And that coincided with the fact that my now ex-wife and I moved to Nashville, and she was getting her MFA in fiction at Vanderbilt University. So I was a freelance science writer, and I was able to sit in on so many of the readings and actually even some of the lectures. So I got like a little taste of an MFA experience. And that's when I started hanging out more with poets. So like I really was like moving in that direction. And then during the 4 months, one of my main correspondences was with my wife at the time, who had collected 120 poems from our writer friends that had something to do with space. Or Mars or the moon, which is like super easy, like a poet writing about the moon. I mean, come on. So she would send that off to me. It was such a wonderful gift. And then we would, that would kind of spur a conversation. It didn't have to be a long conversation, but it was just this regular correspondence, and like just a little bit of shop talk that was great. And it kept me, in a way that kept me grounded, but it also like did the same thing at grounding, but like allowing something kind of above and beyond the actual situation that I was in. So it had that sort of perfect effect of keeping me right where I needed to be.
Were you writing poems then?
Yeah, I have always written something like poems. So I even found in my notes in grad school for physics, in the margins, I'm constantly just writing. What I'm hearing, I kind of riff off of it. And so and the language used in physics is so wonderful. And so like, I was always kind of playing with that. And, my background is, my dad is a Latin teacher, and my mom is also a teacher, but a storyteller. And the thing that, you have, and
I'm so thrilled that your dad was a Latin teacher.
No.
How many times have you taken Latin, dear?
I have taken first year Latin, I think 5 times.
Well, that's I hadn't at all, and I still haven't. Like that's my big shame. I have the opportunity, and then I took French. But so language was really big in my household growing up. And then I think just there's something about the isolation of the Mars mission, and the reading that I did. I definitely brought Tracy K. Smith's Life on Mars. I definitely read Mark Jarman's Bonefires. There's something that sort of crystallized it there for me, that, oh, okay, yeah, I can, I've been hanging out with these poets, and I've been writing these poems, and I've always been doing this. Like maybe I'll keep moving this way.
That's cool.
Well, and I don't know if you want to chime in here, but of course your own first book, Constituents of Matter, features several poems about science, and included an image on the cover that's an actual bubble chamber diagram from the SLAC linear accelerator. An artist turned it into a piece of art. So,
well, I am curious for you, Anna, how like science works into your poetry, because honestly, it's hard for me to use science in my poems. I'm doing something else with the poetry. Like maybe it's a little more surreal or something, but like, how does it work for you when you're writing a poem that takes something from science?
I think that I think of science as full of amazing language and metaphors, and I think part of it is that I have not studied science at an advanced enough level to have a whole lot of the specifics down pat. So I can keep feeling the edge of my science knowledge all the time. And just am aware of the language of science as much as whatever it really means. But I'm curious to know why you think it's difficult for you to actually use the science. I also think when my first book came out and I did some readings, every single place I went, it was like, well, why would a nice little poet like you have any interest in physics? And there were all sorts of assumptions about poetry and science being separate. And I think also that women poets in particular would not be interested in science. And this occurred even at the first reading at Kent State, and they invited the physics department to my reading and talk, and the scientists all came up afterwards, and it wasn't that they thought, oh, you don't belong here, you don't belong in this area of knowledge, but they were just flummoxed as to why someone like me would have the least interest in what they were doing.
Oh my gosh, that's yeah, I think that scientists and poets actually have so much in common in terms of I mean, in so many ways, because I think it's the ineffable, something about like getting close to pushing up against something that you don't know about, which is exactly the same thing that, I mean, we're all doing that. And we all love discovery and surprise. And like for a poet, surprise is like the best thing. If a word just drops in that's so unexpected, I mean, the delight, it's like a bodily experience. I mean, as if the top of my head were blown off is basically like the feeling, right? And also speaking of Emily Dickinson, she was like a nut for geology. So like it even goes back to the beginnings of like modern poetry in America, really, if you think about.
And Marie Curie wrote poems. So
Marie Curie, exactly. I think of, there's just so many examples of poets drawing from the wonders of the natural world, and also what science can tell us and what it can't tell us about the natural world. I think poets and scientists have a lot in common, and I want more scientists to understand that. I think that would be I think that there could be more fun conversations if that were the case. Also, I want more poets to be like not so afraid and be interested in like the actual, this is where it gets tricky. So for me, I feel like if I'm going to write about science or like some sort of like constructed knowledge, something that's like known through science, I kind of want it to be correct. But in my poems, what ends up happening in general, I think is I have like, each poem has its own logic. And so like most of the time in a poem, like it's very not correct in terms of like reality or a description. Like things are pretty off, and I feel like if I brought in something that like came from like science, then I would feel an obligation to be correct about it and maybe to explain a little bit, because I've spent so much of my career explaining science. And then I don't want the poem to explain. I want the poem to maybe like open up more mystery, I think.
I wonder if I don't know enough to know how not correct my poems are. But before I had that first book published, I did sit in on an introductory physics class to sort of check all my science, because because when you're in the poem, you are kind of making it up and
Exactly.
sort of grasping and, oh, does this make sense? If this makes sense, then it's real. But
Exactly.
that doesn't make it correct per se.
Well, I think, and I'm kind of far out of science in many ways, so that it's a little bit more freeing for me. But it's been a process. It's had to be a process. You know, I'm kind of like loosening that that side of me. One example of this was, you know, I was a science writer at Berkeley Lab for a while, and I wrote about physics, and they have a cyclotron there that I wrote about how the cyclotron works, and the cyclotron experiments, actually microchips that are sent into space on spacecraft are all tested in the cyclotron for radiation issues, because in space, you know, radiation is a problem, and you want to know if you've designed a circuit that's going to be robust enough to handle the radiation bombardment that you're going to get in space. So you put it in the cyclotron. That's one of the experiments, right? So I spent time like really understanding this and writing articles that like explain that and other experiments that they do. Super heavy elements, you know, they're like making elements at the end of the periodic table. Very cool stuff. But then a few summers ago, I proposed that I was in grad school for poetry at the time, and I thought this would be really fun if I went during one of their overnight experiments, but not as a science writer, but as a poet. And I brought one of my poet friends from Columbia, and we had an overnight there where we just like wrote crazy stuff. And for me, that was this huge break in like, I can be in the scientific environment, but like make it be wild as it actually is. You know, it doesn't have to be like bound by some exposition. And so that was like a fun experiment on myself that I was conducting, like while the while the neutrons were zipping around. I was definitely.
You should pitch Brookhaven on being their poet in residence.
I would, you know, Brookhaven, if you're listening. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
go ahead.
Well, I mean, I could actually talk more about, or I want to know more about the kind of science that attracts you for a poem. So like what is it about? Is it the poem? Is the poem happening, and then you feel like science needs to go in there, or does science is that the catalyst for you, like a thing that you learn about and then you form it into a poem? Like, how does that work?
I think it can work both ways. What I tend to do is be working on something and sort of accidentally or unintentionally veer into something that brushes against science, and then I'll go down the rabbit hole and read all about it. And then on the other end, I'm writing poems, and all of a sudden, you know, it all pops up in there because I've been steeping myself into it. So it feels spontaneous, but it's because I've primed the brain in a certain way.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Who are you reading these days? Either poets or other science writers or nonfiction or?
Yeah, well, I mean, I just took this online class that I loved, The Invention of the Self, through the Brooklyn Institute of Social Research. And so I read Pascal's Pensées and actually Montaigne's essays. So this is a really, really wonderful class, just looking at the self. And there were so many poetic qualities to both of those. But I'm also just sort of like slogging through a very large biography of Robert Duncan, so a poet sort of in the Berkeley Renaissance and the 60s, and like beat adjacent. It was really interesting because like San Francisco is known for the beats, but then you had like this other school of poetry that was happening, and he's an interesting guy. And as far as science writers go, I actually have a lot of books that I like read a few pages of and then go to another book. Gary Kasparov, his what is it called? Deep. So he's a chess player who, he was a grandmaster.
He's very political now.
Yeah, I saw him talk years ago and was able to pick up his book. It's like Deep Intelligence or something like that. And he talks about the fact that he's the one who just happened to be the best chess player in the world when IBM's Deep Blue came up and was able to beat him. And so this is his account of that. And also he decided to sort of invent this way of playing chess where it's the chess player and the computer working together, playing against someone else who is also a great chess player and with a computer. And so, and what that does is, you know, the computer kind of does the brute force calculations to get you something like that's statistically likely to be the best move, but the human chess player has like the creativity going on, and also like an eye for the sort of aesthetic of the game. And so you're bringing, it's a way of like melding together these two things, like the uniquely human part and then the thing that's uniquely machine. Anyway, so he talks a little bit about that. And because of the Queen's Gambit that show was on, I remembered that I had that book and I thought, oh, I want to read more about that. And yeah, I have a few other books, but like, what are you reading? I know that it's that time in the semester and you're very busy, but what are you both reading when it comes to?
I've just been reading this wonderful book.
Oh, yeah.
If anybody out there listening does not win the raffle, then make sure you put this in your shopping cart. That's my plug. It really is a marvelous book.
And I do want to give a tip of the hat to the Institute for Quantum Studies related to the book too. The last part of our discussion this evening has been about poetry and art and intersections between science, but your years as a science journalist show through markedly in this book. Your discussion about non-relativistic quantum mechanics and entanglement in the chapter on deep time is just, you know, it's absolutely beautiful. So for even practicing scientists will come away with this with just a beautiful understanding of their own field. So I encourage everyone to go out and get a copy of this.
Well, thank you. That's very kind.
I'm wondering if we have any questions from the YouTube audience, and I will say, if you have questions and you're watching, make sure you put them down.
The plug for the book may be a good time to switch over to the Q&A session. First of all, though, we are going to do a giveaway. We've got about 6 copies of the book to give away. I'm going to do this old school style. Right? You have to, in order to get a copy of the book, you have to go to this URL, which I'll also put in the chat room. It's, oops, let me put it in the chat room. It's rebrand.ly/give-me-a-book. I've also put that in the chat room. It is restricted to, sorry, my video is turned off. It is restricted to US and Canada, right? So we're not going to be shipping books worldwide, unfortunately. I wish we could, but those are our constraints. So if you're in the US and Canada and would like a copy of the book, please enter there. And as both Anna and Doug said, even if you don't get it, I recommend you purchase a copy. It has been a very excellent read. So we have a few questions in the chat room already, which I'm going to start with. If there's any more people with questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat room. I'm also, some of the questions are obviously directed towards Kate about the mission, but if you have things that Anna and Doug can weigh in on as well, then please feel free to ask those kind of questions. So I'm going to start with the first question. This was from, and sorry if apologies if I butcher anybody's name. This is from Jason Breimer, who asks, how well did you know?
Jason, thank you for asking a question.
He asks, how well did you know the fellow astronauts before the mission, and how close is the crew post-mission?
Ah, that's a wonderful question. Let's see. We were selected in the summer. Well, we got together in the summer of 2012. The mission was in 2013. And there were 9 of us that were brought together, and we did a sort of cooking class at Cornell in Ithaca, because the co-PI on the project named Gene Hunter as a professor there. And there's a great cooking kitchen, and we were learning how to use these foods. So we got to know each other a little bit then. And then we, throughout the next like 6 months or so, had like conference calls every week. We had a shakedown mission in Utah. There's a facility called Mars Desert Research Station where we spent time for 2 weeks kind of doing a mock version of this mock Mars mission. And then we were just in it together. We hung out for about a week before the actual mission. In terms of on the back end, you know, I am still in contact with everyone. So like I sent everyone the bits of the book that they were in just to see if I, you know, flubbed anything. And but not everyone is in contact with everyone. So that's kind of like the real truth of it. So there are some of us who are closer than others. And, you know, I actually have seen a number of them post mission and, you know, spent time with almost, yeah, a lot of them, from the majority of them. So yeah, it was a strange, it felt a lot like grad school for physics, I have to say, the mission itself, because you're in a very concentrated time and space with some people, and you're working on this goal together. And then at the end, you sort of like disperse, but you will always share that very strange time that you had together, either like aligning optics for a neodymium YAG laser or pretending to be astronauts on Mars. So those are the sorts of things that kind of forge relationships that don't necessarily go away.
I do want to say I'm glad that you brought up the comparison with grad school, because Jason Breimer is actually the husband of my roommate from grad school. So, so it works with the questioner also.
Okay, thanks, Kate. The next question is from Nick DeLuca, who asks, what was a typical day like on the High Seas mission?
Yeah, so you'd wake up. We had a breakfast that happened every morning at around 8:30, and then 8:15 to 8:45. Then we'd have like a 9 o'clock meeting. We had a daily meeting, which not everyone liked. Some people thought that that was not necessary, but it's what happened. And then we had kind of free time. So, and by free time, I mean you were working on your own experiments. So like every day we had experiments that we were participating in and experiments that we were conducting. So we had to fill out surveys and, you know, correspond with people over email. And every day we also had to, well, 5 days a week, we also had to work out. So, and we split that up throughout the day. So no more than 2 people were working out at any given time. But a bunch of us chose to do the P90X workout, which is 4 months. And so I was in the best shape of my life, but that was like a significant part of the day doing that. And then we had lunch. We had like a lot of chores too. So you always have to clean up. You always have to, you know, take care of just the daily living operations. We had, you know, the afternoon, sometimes we would go out for an EVA, and it wouldn't be all of us, but, you know, some of us would put on those spacesuits and walk out and like explore some lava tubes and, you know, collect rocks, because we had geologists on the crew who were doing geology studies. And then we'd have dinner, clean up, and then you'd basically catch up on the rest of the stuff that you weren't able to do, correspondences, reading, what have you. You could relax, watch TV, that sort of thing. Like I said, on Wednesdays and Saturdays, we had movie nights, and that was good. But yeah, it's just like, you're just living. And that's the funny thing about space. Everyone thinks like it's quite exotic, but there's just like a lot of chores and a lot of just stuff you have to do. It's not necessarily fun and games. So you're pretty
And
restricted.
you did a huge amount of report writing and journaling.
I did, yeah. A lot of people journaled though too. You know, I wrote a piece a week for Discover magazine, and like I wrote 5 blog posts for The Economist. So I had I had some writing assignments that I was doing for sure.
Okay, thanks, Kate. The next question is from Liz Harmer. She asks, did you get a sense of how realistic the plans to go to Mars for any serious length of time are?
How realistic the plans to go to Mars? The sense that I got, honestly, is that there's a lot of work to do, not only in the actual engineered systems, but in understanding how to make sure people are happy in this situation. And I mean, happy is kind of like a weird word to use, I guess, but yeah, I think that there's still so many open questions, you know, how you select the crew, how you train the crew together. So it's a long mission, and are they gonna be spending 2 years prior in that training? I know that like all astronaut crews now go through lengthy training, but like that's a long time to sort of be bonded to a particular set of people, and like what are the challenges that occur over time? I mean, those are sorts of questions that aren't quite answered, and that's not necessarily what we or High Seas can answer. High Seas can kind of, the data that was collected from this mission, it should eventually be made public because it's, you know, NASA funded, and then anyone can kind of look and see like who was cranky on what day. I don't know, you know, subject 1, subject 2, you can always figure out like on what mission who was like having a hard time. But I think that the data that was collected, that was analyzed through the various projects that plugged into the larger High Seas project, kind of point NASA in the right direction in designing these systems. There's nothing, you know, coming from a physics background where you're controlling variables so tightly and you're just like really like, I mean, designing an experiment, a solid state physics experiment, you just really are dialing everything in so precisely. And this was a sociological experiment. And for me, I just couldn't believe it. I just thought, how can we know anything? Because this is kind of a mess in terms of data and like what you do with it. Well, I mean, luckily there's some really amazing data massaging techniques that you can get some answers out of it. But more than that, I think it just like points to directions for possible design and other questions that can then be explored in different contexts. So the High Seas project and these simulations aren't at all the end of it. You know, I think that they're just the beginning of the question asking.
So I actually happen to follow Liz on Twitter. And so I know that she's been thinking about this a little bit because earlier today she tweeted out, seems to me if we're planning to go to Mars, we ought to be spending more time learning how to take care of the planet we're already on. And that's a question that whenever you're a space enthusiast or think about these kinds of things, eventually someone somewhere puts to you. Where do you come down on that? What are your thoughts about that? Giving Liz 2 questions for tonight.
It's such a valid feeling, and I feel it too. I feel like there is something that seems inherently sad about looking elsewhere when there are problems that could be solved here. Yeah. So, I mean, I understand that sentiment. Like, I actually feel that sentiment pretty hard. The other thing that I know is that it is possible to see your home differently when you have a wholly new perspective. Now, the challenge, and that's something that space exploration historically has given us, you know, and the Earthrise photo supposedly is related to the environmental movement really taking off. And but I think it's a really complicated thing because I look at the stories of space that we have now and the people who are in charge. It's basically, it's NASA, the old guard, and then you have sort of like the billionaire space cowboys. And I wonder if they actually have the ability to widely distribute that sense of perspective shift. I think that it's not at all a goal in anything that I've heard in those discussions. And I think that that's where it gets to be really disheartening. It makes a lot of people say, what's it all for? Is it for, I mean, is it for capitalism? Is that really going to inspire the next generation? I mean, I don't know. It seems like I don't know how well that sentiment scales. So But I do believe that space does have the possibility to give a perspective shift and allow us to see home in a different way, and can do something good for people if people feel like they are allowed to be a part of that. And I think that's really the challenge. I want more people to feel like space belongs to them too, some ownership in it. I mean, just the last thing I'll say on this is I actually do think it's connected to the fact that the night sky is not as available as it always has been. I mean, that's been a major factor in the development of civilization from the beginning, is like understanding humanity's relationship to the cosmos. And in the past century or so, that's just sort of like vanished. So there is a sort of untethering to the elsewhere that's maybe driving some of the despair around what space can do for us.
Okay, I'm gonna take the questions a little bit out of order now and add something of my own to them. So this is going to be an expanded version of another question from Jason Breimer. And I guess it'll be good if all of you can answer this. So he asked, did anybody want to stay on Mars, which I assume means the High Seas mission, and would you go back? But I'd also like to ask Anna and Doug whether they would volunteer for such a mission.
I'd like to know too.
Go ahead, Anna.
I say that I would, but I say that, yes, I'll go to Mars knowing that I won't go to Mars. I mean, that I wouldn't be selected, that I wouldn't be in the running. And so it's easy to want something that poses no risk because it's so unrealistic. I do think that if there was a mindset shift in the design and that these other goals were more visible, then and they wanted a poet, which I think they should want, then I think I would feel compelled to do it. But as it stands now, you know, my qualifications don't match their criteria. My PhD is in the wrong field.
Well, and so, you know, Kate, one of the things that is documented in the book is that you applied to the NASA astronaut selection process. Like yourself, I meet the minimum qualifications. I have a PhD in a STEM field and went ahead and applied. NASA didn't get back to me. But, you know, that was only a few years ago. Despite the gray and the beard, I'm not quite that old. I was still within astronauts older than me had been selected. I will say that. So that, you know, that desire has been a through line for my entire life. And Anna and I would have to have a long, serious conversation about what that might mean. But of course, you know, sign me up tomorrow. Sign me up tonight if somebody has the paperwork.
Nice. When I heard the question, I heard it for like would you participate in a simulation again or something? That's a question that I'm asked a lot, actually, that I do have an opportunity to do, and I haven't done any other simulations. I think that one is good. One time pretending to live on Mars is fine. And in terms of an actual mission to Mars, I'm okay not going. Maybe surprisingly, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, different answer, I think. But I know about the challenges, and I think Earth is really great, and I think maybe, and not that going to Mars means that you don't think Earth is great, but it's like I want to stick it out. And also, I would love it if a poet were selected for the mission. Anna, I think that that would be really wonderful, and it would be wonderful for you to go. I think that the way that they do it these days is the poets are like, you have to be like a secret poet. You have to be like a pilot and like secretly a poet, and then that's how poets sneak onto these missions. But sometimes if you're too much poet, it makes NASA nervous. But maybe the mission could be designed differently to accommodate a range of people that could give something. And I think that that points to the question of like, if there were poets who were telling the story of this adventure, if that might be the thing that makes it feel like a part, like everyone's a part of it.
So Kate, I'm just curious, as a follow-up to that, I can understand not wanting to go on a Mars mission, but you know, you did previously want to be an astronaut. I wonder where your limit is now. Like, if you were given the opportunity to go into orbit, or to go to the International Space Station, or to go to the moon, would you be interested in any of those?
Okay, yeah, you got me. I would go to the moon, like for sure. I'd go to the moon. I would love to go to the moon. I think about that one a lot, actually. And then, of course, anything else. Yeah, I would love one of those opportunities. I'm not necessarily positioning myself for that right now, so that says something. But I think ideally a 2-week trip to the moon would be pretty rad.
So I mean, there's another question by Nick DeLuca, which is related to all of this. He asks whether you could speak more about your inspiration to join the High Seas project. So you've already mentioned previously applying to be an astronaut. So, but
yeah.
why did you decide to join that project?
I mean, I feel really lucky that they chose me. I wasn't necessarily an obvious candidate, because if you just go by how NASA selects astronauts, I have kind of a different background. But it came from boredom, honestly. I was a freelance journalist, and I didn't have any big stories or obligations ahead of me. And when I saw the article, there's an NPR article about Kim Binsted's interest in food, and at the very end of the article was a link to apply. So just know that sometimes it's valuable to read all the way to the end of the article. And I clicked the link and I read all about it, and I thought, oh yeah, I want to do this. This sounds great. This is like, it felt like it immediately scratched, like, even though I hadn't been selected, just imagining myself doing it scratched the the astronaut kid dream inside me. And I just felt like I have to at least apply. And then, and then it worked out, which was really wonderful.
Okay, so the next question is switching topic a little bit. Somebody wants, this is the career advice for young writers question. So you can all weigh on this a bit. So this is Gin Sen, I think. I don't know if that's the right pronunciation, but asks, how would a young writer get into science writing or balancing writing and research? How did you get started writing?
So I got started writing around 2004, and 2003, 2004. And I think the world is very different now, because I know so many people who I had to go through, or I felt I needed to go through official gatekeeping things. So like, I applied for internships at publications. That still happens now. You can do that, but often you can just start a blog, or now an email newsletter, if you're interested in writing about science, some area of science. So it sounds like you're a scientist. So maybe like one way to do that is to talk about your field, and then sort of like expand out your interest in writing about that for a general audience. The main thing that I did was I just read a lot of science journalism. I paid attention to the structures of it, the way that things are explained, how you get information, you get kind of like broad information at the top of the article, and then like you get context, and then you get like more specific information about the actual experiment. I mean, just I really did analyze how this was done in terms of like news articles, in terms of features, in terms of different kinds of the science writing. And I devoured it like intensely. I did this when I was in grad school for physics. So I was definitely looking for a distraction. I didn't necessarily want to be looking at the laser all day. So I was doing a lot of reading of science journalism and imagining myself as a science journalist in that regard. But I think, yeah, you don't even have to do internships these days. You can just like send out emails or like have a blog or, comment on Twitter. I don't know, your mileage may vary.
Yeah, I would agree with the reading, and every year there's a Best American Science and Nature Writing anthology, and I always get that and take a look at it because it gives a range across different outlets and sort of different formulas and formats. But when you see them all together, no matter where they were originally published, you can see commonalities. You can look at all the beginnings and say, yes, 9 out of 12 do this thing. And so you can sort of pick up the conventions. And then Doug and I think probably the turning point for us into science writing was in part the Santa Fe Science Writing Conference, where we went to Santa Fe, was it a week long? And hung out with other science writers. We're in workshop groups. Each of us was in a different workshop group, so we sort of got the wisdom of 2 different people, and there were lectures, and it was a good way to connect not only with the mentors who were overseeing the workshops, but also to meet science writers at our tier who had done a little bit, who were trying to sort of jumpstart their careers in that direction. And that was really helpful too.
Is that with George Johnson?
Yes.
It is. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are these science writing communities that you can plug into, and the National Association of Science Writers is a great organization that offers fellowships so that you can like travel when that happens again to their conference and sit in on all these workshops. So like, that's a really fun way of getting a lot of information and meeting people who also love to do that.
Yeah, so kind of a 2-part answer. For me personally, I knew I wanted to be a writer when I was an undergrad. I was studying physics, but I went to a liberal arts college, Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. And, my friends, small cloistered institution in the Midwest, and you hung out with everyone, and half my friends were poets and writers. And so I took a workshop in nonfiction writing and a workshop in poetry before I graduated. So all the way back in my formative years. As to more immediate things, if golden ages can ever be said to exist, we currently live in a golden age of science writing. There is more good science writing going on now than it has ever been before, and much of it is available to anyone. There are publications for, if you're really into physics and math, I would take a look at Quanta, which comes from a foundation that does an amazing job. More general purpose science writing in a lot of life sciences appears in Nautilus and Aeon. There's just so much good writing out there that, to echo what Kate and Anna said, read. And I write because I'm a reader, and reading is a foundational part of my life.
And I will say that Scientific American now has a poetry column.
As does Nature.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
And Orion. Oh, Kate, we'll exchange emails afterwards. So I'll give you the contact so you can take a look at that.
Awesome.
All right, thanks. I think we are out of questions now and close to being out of time. I want to really thank Kate for being here for this inspiring discussion, and also Anna and Doug for leading the discussion. It was good to have a break from doing these, and I think it was a really good choice. It was a great discussion. So thank you all of you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks. This was
Matt,
great.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and putting it all together. It was really fun. Anna and Doug, this is really, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thoroughly enjoyed the book and enjoyed meeting you even more than the book. So
And when we all can travel again, we can all get together in person.
That sounds great.
And so just to conclude, I just want to remind everybody of the book giveaway. rebrand.ly/give me a book. I also want to mention that we have our next one of these discussions is scheduled now. It's going to be on December the 9th. We'll be back to quantum mechanics again. I'm going to be talking to Rob Speckens from Perimeter Institute about causality in quantum mechanics. So that should be an interesting one. When you sign up for the book giveaway, you have an opportunity to give us your email address if you like to, if you want to keep informed about future events. If you have already signed up for that, you don't need to do it again. But if anybody is interested in hearing about those. So thanks everybody again, and we will see you, at least some of you, next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, the stream is over, so you can